This Artificial Intelligence and Equality podcast is hosted by Carnegie Council Senior Fellow Wendell Wallach. Together with Anja Kaspersen and an international advisory board, they direct the Carnegie Artificial Intelligence and Equality Initiative, AIEI, which seeks to understand the innumerable ways in which AI impacts equality and international affairs. This episode features Amandeep Singh Gill, being interviewed by Wendell Wallach and Anja Kaspersen. It was recorded on January 23rd, 2023.
Welcome. Anja Kaspersen and I are so pleased to have this AI and Equality podcast with our friend and distinguished colleague, Amandeep Singh Gill, who was appointed UN Secretary-General Guterres' envoy on technology in June of 2022. Amandeep, who holds a PhD in nuclear learning and multilateral forums from King's College London, and a Bachelor of Technology in Electronics and Electrical Communications from Punjab University in Chandigarh, joined India's diplomatic service in 1992. From 2016 to 2018, he was India's ambassador and permanent representative to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, and chaired the group of governmental experts on emerging technologies in the area of lethal autonomous weapon systems for the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. At that time, Anja Kaspersen was in a complementary role as the Director of Disarmament Affairs at the UN in Geneva. And we will return later in our podcast to discuss with both Amandeep and Anja some of the work that was accomplished. From 2018 to 2019, he served as the Executive Director and co-lead of the United Nations Secretary-General's High-Level Panel on Digital Cooperation, after which Amandeep was Chief Executive Officer of the International Digital Health and Artificial Intelligence Research Collaborative, IDEAR, a truly innovative health initiative based at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. Welcome, Amandeep, and congratulations on your recent appointment as the UN Secretary-General's Envoy on Technology.
Thank you very much, Wendell.
Before we discuss your role and what you hope to achieve, perhaps you can help our listeners understand why progress on technology policy and governance at the UN is so slow and so frustrating.
That's a great question to start our conversation with. The UN and its forums work on the basis of certain principles that have been agreed by the international community. And one of those is the sovereign equality of all states. Now, those principles ensure inclusion. They ensure that every country has a say in what happens at the UN. But at the same time, there's a trade-off. Often, this means seeking consensus over a period of time, building understanding of issues across countries, which may be at different levels of understanding on particular issues. And this structural feature of the United Nations becomes quite pronounced when we are discussing technology issues that move fast, that are very advanced in terms of their development and their the consideration of their policy implications in some countries, but not so much in other countries. So when you bring these issues to the UN, it's always not as fast as some stakeholders would like them to be. But I think this is a trade-off that we must embrace. Because at the end of the day, if we are just having like-minded conversations in small groups, in small geographies where tech considerations are quite advanced, then we are leaving some people behind. And in the UN, it's important not to leave anyone behind. And this is a kind of a general reason for why things are slow, but they need not be slow each and every time. So there are opportunities where we can accelerate the consideration of issues by thorough preparation, by engaging multiple stakeholders beyond governments, which means civil society, academia, the tech community, the private sector, and by taking full advantage of some of the flexibilities that the rules of procedure within the UN forums provide us. So you see this at play increasingly, whether it is discussions around digital cooperation, or it is discussions around gender issues, climate change, etc., where you have this interplay of multilateral forums and multi-stakeholder communities and discussions on the margins or linked to these intergovernmental discussions in multilateral forums. So I'm more or less optimistic about how we can handle technology in UN forums, but still mindful of these constraints.
You've had so many roles, but perhaps it would be helpful for our listeners if they understand the difference between those projects that have been initiated by the Secretary-General, those projects that have actually been authorized by the General Assembly, and projects or initiatives or bodies that meet within the UN but are not formally part of the UN. Can you help us understand those distinctions?
Right, and exactly, and what you've described so eloquently, these kind of three type of initiatives, if we get their orchestration right, then we can move faster and qualitatively differently. So in the last few years, the focus on technology issues has been there for the Secretary-General. It is a priority alongside key challenges around peace and security, climate change, gender, etc. And now he has driven some of the discussions by taking initiatives that were within his authority. So setting up of the high-level panel on digital cooperation, these 22 members, 11 men, 11 women, who came from all walks of life. And the panel was chaired for the first time by two members who were not from the government sector. So Jack Ma and Melinda Gates, they came from the private sector and from philanthropy. So this was an initiative of the Secretary-General, but it led to a process in which the member states started to participate. They discussed the conclusions. There was a roadmap on digital cooperation that was put together. And now we are moving into a process that is decided by member states through a resolution of the General Assembly. And that resolution passed in October of last year calls for a summit of the future in 2024. And as part of the intergovernmental process of preparing for that summit of the future, digital issues constitute a track in themselves. So they are an important intergovernmental track for this summit. And the idea is to come together with something called the Global Digital Compact, a kind of charter of principles for an open, free, secure, and inclusive digital future for all. So what does that look like? What kind of principles should be shared across all nations? How do we go beyond principles to land the guidance of the international community into the practice of governments and private sector, etc.
Before we go into greater detail on the Global Digital Compact, I'd sort of like to touch upon about two things with you. First, I was interested in your noting that the panel led by Jack Ma and Melinda Gates was one of the first times the UN had a higher level panel led by people who were not diplomats or governmental leaders. And that raises this question of how essential that is when we're talking about technology governance, or whether or not we think the multilateral process can be sufficient without this participation by tech leaders. Some of us are very skeptical of multilateralism. As you know, in this context, we think that we're dealing with corporations who are often much more powerful than all but a few states. And we're also deeply concerned that few of the states really understand the technologies at all. So I wonder if you can illuminate us a little bit on how you understand the multilateral process and whether that's even the right place for us to try and formulate policies about emerging technologies.
Right. In practice, when states are engaged in multilateral diplomacy, negotiation, policy making at the UN, they represent the interests of all stakeholders, including private companies that are on their soil. So that's in theory, but in practice, often there is a gap because the UN negotiations are led by diplomats from foreign ministries who may or may not have the resources or the inclination to coordinate with other ministries that may be dealing with the substantive aspects of digital issues, information and communication technologies ministries, or ministries of finance ministries that are engaged with building up the digital infrastructure in the country. So that's why you have to find ways of kind of engaging with the multi-stakeholder communities beyond this established channel of ministries representing these wider interests. The power element is something that people have woken up to, but it's been around. I mean, the power of transnational corporations as actors in international relations has been recognized by international relations academics, from the 1960s onwards. But digital is a different beast. The market capitalization, the concentration of wealth, resources, and power in a few companies, it's of a different nature. So it's really woken up people, and therefore you see an impact. Even governments beyond the dozen or 15 governments that are really into this on for a while, they have woken up to this, and they are orchestrating their positions much better with the private sector players and others back home. And still there is a gap, and that's where I think these multi-stakeholder consultations, and I should hasten to add that this panel was not only it was led for the first time by two non-governmental people, but there is a tradition of multi-stakeholder engagement going back to the days of the World Summit on Information Society, 2003, 2005.
As you know, I've been a champion of the international governance, of putting in place some mechanisms for the international governance of AI. And I would love to see that in the UN, but I've also been skeptical whether the UN is really so constructed that it is possible, and whether we should be looking outside of the UN of creating mechanisms that function outside or in partnership. I don't want to put you on the spot, but you are obviously literate and deeply submersed in these questions around the governance. And how do you see that? Do you see that the UN really can take the leadership role that we would like to see it take, obviously, because it is our one global institution that can represent everyone? But if it can't happen within the UN, and the slowness of some of these processes makes many of us skeptical, we are going to have to move outside of the UN and put something else in place. So share with me a few of your reflections on that.
Right. So let me give you a few reasons why the UN's role is important. I think first, there is no other universal forum where every country is represented, where you have a charter that is still inspiring, that reflects shared human values, shared human principles, and where you have a variety of forums where people can come together also around specific themes, whether it's health, environment, gender issues, meteorology, you name it. You have these forums that have been built up over decades, in some cases more than a century and a half. So you have that basis, that universal convening capacity to bring people together broadly, but also in specific areas. And that's unique, that's unparalleled. Nothing really matches that. The second reason why it's important in the digital field, why UN's role is important, is that UN has some basic touchstones that are really critical to managing the problem of misuse or misuse of digital technologies. And those are, firstly, the human rights framework, international human rights law, starting with the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the various conventions and treaties around human rights. If the digital future is not human-centric, if it doesn't respect human rights, human agency, human choice, then we are lost. So I think UN has that touchstone. The other touchstone that the UN has is Agenda 2030, or the Sustainable Development Goals. These 17 goals that are shared across the international community, regardless of income level, where we are addressing certain planetary challenges, from poverty and hunger to the green transition, to climate change, to the empowerment of women and other communities. So you have these kind of unique attributes of the UN, apart from the convening capacity. And the third reason, the final reason I'd say UN matters, is that today you have the leadership and the vision and the pathways, including what I mentioned about the Global Digital Compact, to kind of pull different strands together and come up with something that is not, it's not exclusive to the UN, but at least it is taken to the level of leaders through the UN, so that it can have more impact when it comes down to the tech sector, the private companies, in whatever region of the world that you are in. I mean, if we just focus on one region and do something nice there, if it doesn't have an impact on the next billion to come online in Africa, in Southern Asia, and in Latin America, then we are missing something. And so we have that opportunity as well today with the UN's role.
So you've emphasized the strengths of the UN and what the UN brings into play. You don't have to comment on this, but I think for many of us, there's this concern with the UN's weakness. The structure of the UN, the countries that have power within the UN, particularly like the Security Council and other areas, and the difficulty of creating consensus within the UN, and whether that will obviate some of those clear benefits that you have described.
Definitely. So I'm not blind to them. In fact, the UN reflects the world as it was in 1945. The world has changed a lot.
Yeah.
The rise of the global south, I mean, the structure, what the Security Council is today does not reflect the realities of the world today, or what the world will be 10 years from now. So there has to be a constant attempt to reform the UN, including the Security Council, to adapt our methods to be more relevant to the younger generation. And I'll be the first one to admit that we have to do much better as the UN. I think we have to invest more in terms of our own capacity to understand these issues, the digital capacity. I mean, how many data scientists do we have? What is their age profile? Those are kind of the hard questions that we need to be asking ourselves. How coordinated, collaborative we are across different organizations. Are we competing for funding? Are we, coming up with similar ideas, but not collaborating with each other? So those are questions that, in fact, my office has been, as part of its work, is looking into as well.
Wonderful. Well, before I bring Anja in and talk about some of the work that the two of you focused on together, let's just flesh out two aspects of your present role. First, just explain to us a little bit, what is the role of being the envoy on technology? As it's a totally new position, and what do you hope to accomplish?
Right. So the briefest description I can give is the focal point within the UN system for technology issues, in particular digital cooperation. So just as governments today are appointing tech envoys, or have chief digital officers, what have you, chief data scientists. So within the UN, a need was felt that there should be a focal point on these issues at a senior enough level, so that private sector, civil society, others who are bewildered by the UN, and some of your questions reflected that, they have a single window that they can come to. Part of that is also inward facing, which means coordination, coherence across the UN system. We have, and this is a good development, different agencies taking the lead on different digital issues, the International Telecommunications Union on connectivity and other issues, capacity building, UNDP on the development side of digital. So how can we put all those different capacities together and be more powerful, be more impactful on the ground, so that coherence side of the role is there. And then I think in terms of substance, I would really divide this role into two big pillars. One is the governance pillar, avoiding the misuse, avoiding fragmentation of effort, fragmentation of the internet, reinforcing digital cooperation around the policy, around the societal and economic implications. And the other side is, how do we leverage these opportunities to accelerate progress on the sustainable development goals? So, how to kind of leverage the digital transformation on the development side. So this is briefly the role that this position entails.
Do I understand correctly, though, that you are totally focused on what I would call the outwardly turning missions of the UN, as opposed to the way the UN itself uses technology?
Yes, so it's not about putting laptops and desktops, ensuring cybersecurity, running the UN's data centers. So I have very capable colleagues who are looking at the ICT side of the equation. So this is more about the policy side of the equation, like what does the metaverse entail in terms of human rights implications or surveillance of individuals and societies. What is online harm, and how can countries collaborate better to address online harm? So those kind of issues, not the ICT nuts and bolts of the UN.
But there's also been UN initiatives that are directed at using technology in explicit ways to address the SDGs. Are you working with those teams, or are they a separate function within the UN?
So definitely. So I work with all these teams, and we look at how we can empower them, how we can add value to their work, how we can enable more partnerships for them. So if you look at, for instance, this aspect of supporting member states on their digital transformation. So we have started an effort on building what we call the common blueprint on digital transformations. So pooling the expertise, the knowledge of different UN entities on various aspects, whether it's the UNDP, ITU tools on maturity assessments, or UNCTAD's tools, UN Conference on Trade and Development's tools on e-commerce, etc. So put them together into a kind of end-to-end guidance on the digital transformation. So we work with all those teams, and we are in a sense a kind of a service entity, an enabler, a catalyst for some of these efforts, also putting more political attention. So I've been engaged with the G20 presidency of India, followed by Brazil and South Africa, and previously Indonesia, to see how we can bump up the digital for development agenda as a political priority. That's a cross-UN type of an issue. If that results in initiatives, greater attention, greater resources on digital for development, that has a positive implication for all those teams that are working within the UN to deploy digital technologies responsibly, inclusively, and in an impactful way.
So if I've understood you correctly, you aren't saying that you are the head or in charge of all those initiatives. They are more distributed. Groups like Global Pulse and some of these other initiatives you've talked about, they have their own mandates, but you're working together with them.
Exactly.
Wonderful. So one more question, just tell us a little bit more about this Global Digital Compact, since that, as I'm understanding, is the next big project, and the fact that the General Assembly has in effect endorsed that or authorized that raises it above many of the other activities that at least the SG's office is able to initiate. So can you tell us a bit more about the Global Digital Compact, how you understand it at this stage, what you hope it will achieve, and what is still unclear as you move toward putting it in place?
Right. And it'll also allow me to answer one of your previous questions about, what does success look like? The international community has come up with compacts in a couple of other areas, refugees, migration, where a need was felt to refresh thinking on norms, and also to build a regular conversation under a large tent. So kind of bring in more communities into the conversation. Treaty making in the UN is difficult. Norm making is not easy, it takes time. So is there a way to refresh our thinking on norms without getting into that? So that's, in a sense, the origin of some of these compacts. And you see how they have changed the landscape. On migration and refugees, for instance, there are regular consultations, there are large forums every 2 years, 4 years. So you are able to kind of implement some of the earlier norms in a more kind of inclusive and impactful way. So this is the thinking for the Global Digital Compact as well. How can we align approaches on the governance of digital technologies around the world in a fragmented world today, so that we are able to kind of not leave any gaps in governance, and also not have people work at cross purposes in different domains. The process is going to be intergovernmental. So there are 2 countries who are going to be leading this process, Sweden and Rwanda. They are called co-facilitators, and they'll hold their first meeting next week, in fact, a week from now. And a process of consultations will continue for about 6 months. And then at some stage, it will tip over into an intergovernmental negotiation on the content of the Global Digital Compact. So it is too early for me to kind of speculate on what that content would be like. But the Secretary-General has given some areas that, we should reasonably expect to be part of that compact. That includes universal connectivity, making sure that, for instance, every school, every health facility on the planet has internet access. We saw during COVID how important this is for societal resilience, for well-being, and then addressing online harm, protecting human rights online as we protect them offline, addressing misinformation, disinformation, making sure that data is protected and people have choices over how their data is used. So this aspect of data empowerment, addressing AI, aligning AI governance with our human values, and also looking at digital public goods, digital public infrastructure as these kind of digital commons that have common rails, guardrails, and that allow people to access services, build their own services, build their own businesses with lower entry barriers. Because if we have, instead of commons, a clubs kind of a thing, then only a few people will benefit. And instead, we need commons where more people can take advantage of the digital opportunity. So those are some of the areas that could fall under the GDC. And the hope is that by September 2023, when the ministers meet to set the agenda for the leaders in 2024, then we have advanced sufficiently on these different substantive issues by consulting not just amongst the governments, but also outside civil society, academia, and others, and produced a kind of substantive basis, a background for the ministers to look at what should be on the agenda, what should we be negotiating. And then, we have time after that to flesh that out.
Great. This has truly been edifying, and you put it so clearly and succinctly that I hope this has helped our listeners get a better sense of what's taking place in the UN around technology policy as we move forward. But let's move back for a few years, if you don't mind. Discussions on whether autonomous weapon systems could or should be regulated began at the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons in 2014. And in that year, they did the first of what were 3 yearly series of informal experts testimony. I was among one of the experts who testified. At the end of the 3rd year, the topic was bumped up to a more formal group of governmental experts, what was called the GGE, on emerging technologies in the area of lethal autonomous weapon systems. And if I understand it correctly, the charge of that GGE was to explore the prospect of putting in place binding regulations. You chaired the GGE and worked closely together with my colleague and co-director of the AIEI project, Anja, who was at the time the director of disarmament affairs for the UN in Geneva. While unable to reach agreement on regulations, you were, however, able to shepherd the 125 nations to agree upon 10 guiding principles for the deployment of autonomous weapon systems. I want to ask you both, and we'll start with you, Amandeep. I want to ask you both how you view those principles today and whether they have been effective. Amandeep.
Those principles that the 125 high contracting parties, as they are called, agreed on, are a valuable contribution, not just to addressing the specific problem of regulating AI in the weapons space, but also broadly how we address the implications of artificial intelligence. Let me just take one example from those principles to illustrate what I say. So when we said that international humanitarian law continues to apply fully to the use of all weapon systems, including any lethal autonomous weapon systems, what we meant by that is that regardless of the direction that technology may take, there are certain essential norms, analog norms, human norms that we must continue to uphold. So we gave ourselves a standard, a touchstone, to see if technology is going in the right direction or not. So this was an instance of a technology neutral policy guidance being crafted together, not only by governments, but they were, as you participated as an expert, many other experts did as well, in close consultation with other stakeholders. So where these principles matter is in terms of the substance, but also in terms of charting a new path for regulating digital technologies, which is, you get what you can and then you build on top of that. Because if we go straight away into treaty making, that may take a lot of time, and technology moves very fast, and we may find it hard to have consensus. And when we do, it may be at a common denominator, which is not that meaningful. So by working on these shared principles and then shared understandings of what different things are, we start to have an impact on how technology is developed and thought about more quickly than we would through traditional means. So I would highlight both the substantive side and the kind of process, procedural side of it in terms of a good legacy to have.
So if I understand you correctly, you were putting in place building blocks and trying to lay the foundation to talk about the next level of issues. As you've observed what is going on in the development of AI, do you feel those building blocks are, what shall I say, being taken seriously by corporations and governments, or do you think they've more or less forgotten that they were put in place?
I don't think they've been forgotten. You know, I was involved in an exercise that the IEEE did a couple of years after the adoption of these principles. And so we looked at, you know, how these were being reflected, how different militaries were looking at the development of these technologies. And you see that there is reference being made to these principles. So they are having an impact, at least they are being referenced, downloaded, looked at. Now, we don't have a mechanism today to actually check, except an existing mechanism called weapons reviews, which, you know, some countries abide by. So I think the next challenge really is, you know, you have the principles, you have the building blocks of understandings, approaches. The next challenge is, how do we have an exchange of experience on how are we implementing these principles? And I think this is a crucial point also for the Global Digital Compact. So if we do not have these regular conversations, these forums, these designated tables for discussing follow-up on certain issues, then how do we know that we are making progress? You know, how do we learn from each other? Because landing principles in practice gives you some lessons, you know, good and bad lessons, and you need a place where you can come back and discuss those. And then everyone goes back and iterates and, you know, improves their understanding, the implementation of those principles. So I think that's the gap that still needs to be plugged, but the principles and the common blocks have given us a foundation for that.
Anja, maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you view these 10 guiding principles for the deployment of autonomous, of AI really, not just autonomous weapon systems that Amandeep has just discussed.
Well, first of all, I agree with everything that Amandeep just said, and I'll comment a little bit to your question, Wendell, and then I'm actually going to comment on the chairmanship of Amandeep, which I also think will be of interest for those listening in to learn a thing or two about multilateral diplomacy. And as you alluded to, Wendell, informal discussions were launched as early as 2014, prompted by France at the time, within the UN's 1980, so this is an old treaty, Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, also shortened to CCW. And I would opine that discussions and negotiations has evolved a lot since, which also Amandeep alluded to. Some would say, quite a few would say, that far from where it ought to be at this stage, and the disagreements are obviously still looming large. But I think it's still important to recognize just how far the multilateral understanding and collective thinking around complex issues and concepts, which is not just relevant in the discussions around military necessity and military technologies and deployments, which is the same type of issues that we see in every type of field that embeds AI or develops AI or try to use AI in accordance with sound societal principles. So it's important to recognize that these are shared challenges, not just in the military domain, but the discussions has evolved a lot. And I certainly experienced this firsthand, and I think Amandeep would agree with me that having been part of the arms control and non-proliferation community for a long time, and also focusing a lot on multilateral learning within the arms control environment, and I think particularly now amidst fractured international relations, it is important to keep in mind also that when we cogitate issues such as autonomy and autonomous features in AI relevant in a national security setting, that's a particular topic as well. So although some of the challenges and opportunities are shared, we are talking about a technology that presents very unique challenges, but also opportunities, both for territorial defense and national competitiveness and sovereignty. And that needs to be also taken into regard when discussing these issues. Now, Amandeep referred to the 10 guiding principle. There was a 11th one that was added the year after, which again sort of just under supports the principle of IHL, applying and that IHL and international law still stands strong for any weapon systems, including any type of new emerging technology and AI embedded into weapon systems. I think for both of us looking ahead at the time, and we were hoping that this would definitely serve as a threshold. You used the word building blocks, Wendell, which I think is a very good one. to capture what already then in 2018 appeared to present rather significant conundrums and tension points. I would just like to mention a few other principles, which I really think demonstrates the foresight shown by the high contracting parties at the time, and thanks also to Amandeep's chairmanship. One is that IHL applies fully to all weapon systems. We talked about that already. But it was also the first time there was a deep recognition among member states that it should apply for the entire life cycle of the weapon system. So not just the part where it gets deployed, because then we all know a thing or two about AI, it's too late. So it was very much to look at, that entire process, which means that you're dealing with quite different type of actors than what you would do normally in circumstances of discussing an arms control treaty, where you typically look more towards the latter phases, the deployment phase. There's also the point about responsible chain of human command and control. So it doesn't speak about meaningful, responsible chain. We, you and I, Wendell, have had a few articles out where we sort of question this notion of meaningful human control almost as a panacea, when we deeply know that these are technologies, once embedded, are not that easy to be controlled by a human in the loop. So what we were speaking about at the time, what the high contracting parties were speaking of, was this responsible chain. What does that look like? What needs to be done to put that in place? It was also one of the first time that, this may seem strange to some of the listeners, that at the time there was not a lot of connections between discussions going on about cyber and discussions happening about lethal autonomous weapon systems. So the principles also try to bring this together by actually focusing on physical security, physical safeguards, protection against hacking and data spoofing. There was also the risk of acquisition by terrorist groups. And lastly, also reflecting on the risks of an arms race based on perception of capability, meaning the risk of proliferation also needed to be considered properly. There's also a principle around the necessity of risk assessment and mitigation measures. So, our favorite topic, Wendell, ethics, essentially. How do you embed that into the life cycle of any form of discussions around these systems? And, and Amandeep, and my favorite point, one should not anthropomorphize these systems, which of course were very foresight at the time, but now with ChatGPT, we've seen the evolution of, deep fakes and technologies, generative image technologies that allows us to present technologies and systems with human features. Anthropomorphize, basically means attributing human features to a computer system. And this is not typically a word that gets often discussed in a military context, but it was very important at the time because the trends was already there. The temptation of doing so in an imperfect environment, which, a battlefield would necessarily be, and to also, use this as a tool of deception was something to be addressed already early on. So I would say that there's a lot of foresight in these building blocks, and foresight that I think whatever the discussion, whatever form the discussion takes looking forward, should definitely make sure to integrate. And Amandeep, I'm very curious. I now spoken about my impressions from all of this, but I would love to have your comments to what I just said.
No, I think this is, you explain the principles and their substantive importance. So I'd just like to return to this kind of procedural impact, the principles-based approaches to digital governance. You see this now being taken forward in UNESCO with the recommendation on AI ethics, where you have similar principles, and then different domains like building blocks are described and policy recommendations given around literacy, capacity building, or checking for biases, etc. So this model has spread somewhat, and that's a good thing. But we need to kind of fill in those spaces that are still, in a sense, not clear enough in terms of how are you landing principles in practice? How are you sharing experience around those? What are you learning? Are you building some meta knowledge about governance through that? And this is the next challenge, and that needs to be taken care of relatively quickly, because otherwise, principles by themselves people will get tired of them if they are not brought into practice.
And Amandeep, I had the pleasure working next to you when you were chairing not only the CCW GGE discussions, but also other treaty discussions. And many of our listeners probably know that you're also a published poet. And I saw a experienced arms control diplomat sometimes bringing in poetry into arms control treaty negotiations, especially when it got really, really tense in the room. It would be very interesting for our listeners to also hear a little bit about your experience of actually overseeing a discussion that gets so tense as this would sometimes do in any form of arms control negotiations. What was some of the learnings that you took away from this, and what you think is important that our listeners understand about being involved in such a process?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think the biggest learning was about transdisciplinarity. Having been trained as an engineer, so I must admit, I also had this tendency to look at only the tech side of things, the power that technology bestows on its developers. But I think unless you bring the social sciences, the behavioral aspects, the ethics side of it, and come at it from different perspectives, you're going to miss out on some risks. So poetry is just one aspect of it. You kind of move away from prose, which is very directing, which comes from certain areas of knowledge making. So poetry just yanks you out of that, and it's a good device to kind of force you back into a kind of almost like I'm not taking a position type of a stance, and I'm looking at it from different perspectives, so that the right choices, the wise choices can be made. So transdisciplinarity, certainly. And then, dealing with health, which is such a sensitive issue at a personal level, but also at a societal level. We talk about social determinants of health. You just can't bring data and AI to health and, solve health problems of health coverage, access to quality health services. You have to do it from a transdisciplinary lens. And there's again a big learning from those days.
So for those attending the Future Summit, they can expect a few poetry sessions as well?
Well, I hope so. We get the opportunity to. I won't be chairing, so I can pass on chits to the chairs and keep them in the right frame of mind.
Great.
In our conversations together over the years, I mean, the two of you are very steeped in understanding the difficulties of multilateral processes, where I function as, if not the embodiment of impatience, at least the expression that we don't have so much time to futz around with these technologies, that they get deployed very quickly, and they get entrenched in our societies in ways where it becomes almost impossible to reform or alter them after the fact. So particularly when we're talking about autonomous weapons systems, I think we are in grave danger. There have been many prognosticators who expect that if autonomous weapon systems have not already been deployed, which is sometimes hard to know, whether they have or have not, since the difference between a weapon system that has had human decision-making and machine decision-making may be the difference between software code and a switch that's not easily discoverable. It is suspected that they will be deployed in the Ukraine. And it's not even clear which side will deploy them first. That both sides have perhaps been looking at them. And this becomes this serious question of escalation and justification. Once they get deployed, then that becomes other countries' justifications for what they do. So I'm constantly this person who's at least expressing that as important as getting all the details right, what shall I say? These become challenges in which getting it right or perfect can be the enemy of the good, or the enemy of just moving forward at a more expeditious pace. So I want to first ask you, Amandeep, and then Anja, how are we progressing so far in your mind in putting in place international binding regulations on the use of autonomous weapons systems?
The Secretary-General has been quite clear in his pronouncements from 2018 onward. He's kind of put his flag down in a very clear area, and that is that machines should not have decision-making power over life and death. Now, that said, we have the intergovernmental discussion that is taking place in the CCW. And my colleagues at the ODA, the Office of Disarmament Affairs, they are supporting that discussion. That discussion is moving along from principles to these building blocks and the sharing of understandings. But I believe time is of the essence. Just like you, Wendell, I think this is a discussion that needs to move. It needs to result in actions, in outcomes that allow us to kind of take that guidance, that touchstone in the principles, in the pronouncements of the Secretary-General, the pronouncements of many countries and civil society, so that the risks that you mentioned, and there are many theaters of conflict. The world is in a difficult situation today. We don't add this additional aspect of uncertainty, of escalation. We have enough to deal with already with other weapons of mass destruction, with cyber weapons. Again, an area where international outcomes are important. There are these 11 norms on cyber warfare, but how do we land norms in practice? There is a discussion going on cybercrime in Vienna and in New York. So these different aspects of the digital and security interface, whether it's AI, old-fashioned and not so old-fashioned cyber weapons, and cybercrime, they need to kind of move along and faster, because without that, we will not have trust in the digital economy. Without that, we will have less trust across nations. And without that, we will have more uncertainty around escalation, around proliferation to non-state actors.
What do you think, Anja?
You know, Oppenheimer, when he was speaking about his role in developing the nuclear weapon, he often spoke about how he regretted not having had sufficient foresight in explaining what the impact could be, societal, political, economics. I think we have the foresight at this point, what the impact could be. I think what is lacking, as Amandeep was referring to, is an honest dialogue between states, which is very difficult at this point in time. I also think time is of essence. I think so, to my earlier point, I don't think we should throw out the hard work that has happened in the intergovernmental side of things, but I also think we shouldn't step away from the gas pedal in making sure that we move forward at the trajectory which is needed to mitigate harm.
One of the things I'm wondering in all of this, when we first started talking about the need to, which I say that small body of scholars and policy planners who did have the foresight very early on how problematic these kinds of weapon systems were going to be. When we used to express that early on, what I largely heard from the diplomatic community was, yeah, that may be true, but we can't regulate it. I mean, we're talking about subtle distinctions between whether a system was humanly controlled or directed and whether its actions were at the initiation of its own software, its own powers of discrimination, or what it had. I do sense that something has changed in the sense that it's not as if we know how to manage or have any degree of effective oversight of limitations on this kind of weaponry. But I'm sort of starting to feel that all the military advisors and policy people are getting that the foresight that was coming from the scholars and a few of the policy people was right. We actually can't humanly control these systems very well. And therefore the dangers they pose are very high, even though the problems of verification are still there, the problems of how you might regulate these systems in an effective way are still there, and therefore they might get deployed no matter what.
I think one of the things that I find very encouraging, so let me respond to your rather, sort of more downbeaten comment, with more on something more positive. I see this, and I think Amandeep, I've seen the same thing, the engagement from groups and communities and transdisciplinary professionals and scholars and everyone really, down to, young people in schools. The engagement on this issue is quite remarkable for an issue that is as serious and as technical as this is. So I think the broad level of engagement is very encouraging. But as you said, there are obvious challenges to making sure that we get the discussion to where it needs to be among states. And I think that's where we really need to come together and ask, like, are we discussing this in the right type of forums? Is it the right type of framing? And you mentioned verification as one issue, and Amandeep obviously have a lot more experience in this, but on an issue like AI, emerging technologies, verification will obviously be the most difficult thing to actually come up with something that works, and also kind of where any discussion almost needs to start. So it's quite counterintuitive to a normal arms control instrument where you will come to agreement of what you're trying to regulate, and then you will come to an agreement on how you're actually going to verify that agreement. And in the case of AI, you can only agree on what you actually know that you're capable of verifying, because so complex are the systems that we're building that verification actually becomes the big Achilles heel of its effectiveness. And that's very difficult, but which is why I go back to this point that it's very encouraging to see that we have all the right type of communities involved to be able to have that discussion if we open up for it. I'm not sure what you think of this, Amandeep.
No, I think that's right. I mean, traditional arms control methods and approaches may not work in this space. And just looking at it from a non-military perspective, because the larger issue is the nature of AI, at least the current paradigm of what we call AI. And it's being deployed in many sectors. In health, again, you have life and death type of decisions, and different regulatory bodies have started to regulate AI for health in their own ways. There are commonalities. The EU has a risk-based approach. Others may have a different approach. So I think we need to come at it from different angles and drive this kind of diversity of AI governance experiences into a common area, where then, a kind of, as the reverse of that process, it spills back into different domains again. So, for instance, if you are looking at certifying algorithms that are used to assess certain kinds of health risks and assist doctors and others in making diagnostic decisions, then the algorithm learns in the field, its performance changes, At what point does it come back for recertification? Same thing with weapons. And people in the commercial space may have proprietary data sets, they may have proprietary algorithms, etc. And likewise, in the military space, you'll have those considerations of confidentiality, etc. But then if there is a way, there is no equivalent of a national regulator, the FDA or something like that, in the military space at the international level. National level, yes, there are these weapons reviews for some, if not all, but we need to find a place internationally where you can talk about these experiences. Sometimes the duds and the mishaps that you've had with certain approaches, it may be in your own interest to tell others about it. And again, reaching back into nuclear history, the PALs, the phased action links, which kept nuclear weapons safe, there was a decision to kind of leak them to the other side because it benefited everyone.
When we all first entered this conversation, there was this strong expression of commitment to international humanitarian law. And that seemed to be an underpinning of everyone's conversation. It didn't matter whether it was the Americans or the Chinese or the Russians. They all gave this strong expression of the need to reinforce international humanitarian law in this space. And now here we are. We've reached this point where there seems to be a general consensus that we need to regulate the deployment of these systems. There's also knowledge that it's not going to take place in that simple arms control and verification frameworks that have worked for other kinds of weaponry. And therefore, you probably need a higher degree of trust that everyone will follow guidelines that are put in place. But have we reached this point where putting those guidelines in place is becoming even more difficult? In other words, are we confronting an intractable problem, largely in light of what we're witnessing as war crimes by Russia in the Ukraine? In other words, we now have one of the great powers. Russia isn't quite the power it was 20 years ago, but we nevertheless have one of the great powers that in international forums might want to give lip service to international humanitarian law, but it doesn't look like in practice they will follow it. And if that's going to be the case with autonomous weapon systems, whether they're lethal or just damaging in other ways, then we may have an intractable problem in terms of whether we can actually put effective regulations in place.
Yeah, so Wendell, military issues, security issues are no longer my remit, so I'll refrain from going into that. But I would say just on IHL, I think professional militaries all around the world have an interest in upholding IHL. They work with international law experts. They have certain kind of protocols, trainings, etc. So I think if we anchor the lethal autonomous weapons discussion in IHL, there's a good reason. I think that is a basis for a common understanding. You're balancing military necessity with the humanitarian imperative, and you're bringing a humanitarian perspective to a technology issue. I think this shouldn't be underestimated. This is quite an achievement. I think what we need to focus on now is the relatively unglamorous work of building those conversations, tables of exchange, designing them in a way that it's a safe setting. The professionals are there, the transdisciplinary expertise is there, some kind of sharing happens, and it is curated as common knowledge for the benefit of everyone. The good news is that this is beginning to happen in other sectors. So, here I'm a little more confident in saying what I'm saying. For instance, philanthropic organizations are taking inspiration from the WHO's guidance on AI and data governance, the UNESCO AI ethics principles, and they are beginning to look at their grants to different regions, seeing how are people deploying AI for health, what are they learning in terms of governance, in terms of biases in data sets, data governance, and can we pull it together for everyone's benefit? So I think this is a movement that needs to be sustained in different fields, and it may have collateral benefits for areas where it is relatively more difficult today to make progress.
So before I take us into another subject area, Anja, is there something you want to say in respect to this matter?
I would have to concur with Amandeep. This is no longer my remit either. So I agree with everything you said. We need better dialogues.
Before we end this, Anja and I thought it would be nice if we talk a little bit about another subject. So in our public face and with this audience, we talk very much about technology governance and technology ethics, but among ourselves, we often talk about self-understanding, about philosophy and spirituality, particularly Indian philosophy and spirituality, something that has interested all three of us for a long period of time, obviously naturally for you, Amandeep. But given that serious influence in Indian philosophy and spirituality, I wonder how it's influenced your focus on the development and deployment of emerging technologies, Amandeep.
Yes, that's an important influence. It's a daily influence in some ways. I think that deep wisdom that's there in Vedanta, in the ancient Indian texts, I find the same wisdom in other cultures. Rumi's poetry, for instance, or what Jesus Christ said in his Sermon on the Mount. So, that deep wisdom is common across humanity. But perhaps because I come from that culture, it's easier for me to relate to Vedanta or what, Ramana Maharishi has said about the nature of the self, or what the Shiva Sutras and the Spanda Karikas say about the nature of the world, the nature of the universe that we live in. And in a strange way, it's very similar to what I've studied in modern physics, in quantum physics. So there are these interesting parallels between some of that deeper wisdom and what modern science is telling us as today. And it's also taught me some humility that, although trained as an engineer, a lot of science in my professional career, but I think we don't know enough. So humility is very important. There are unknown unknowns. And so we need to be careful. And I think the digital world is a nice mirror to humanity, AI in particular, because it seeks to emulate human intelligence. So for us to understand what is human intelligence, what is being human, what is being intelligent, and then, where you are being deluded, or, there's an attempt to delude, or, there's a risk of delusion, again, what's real and what's not real. So those are kind of, things that strike you every day as you're dealing with technology, as you're dealing with AI and the implications of all that's happening around us. So it's a good touchstone, just like, I mentioned the human rights and the sustainable development goals as a touchstone. This kind of philosophy, not to be deluded by what's not real, to look very deeply at, what is it to be human and what is it to be intelligent, really, that's helpful.
Can I push you a little bit? Because in my understanding of you, it's not just philosophy, but it's very grounded in who you are. It's embodied in who you are. It's not just the ideas you have. Is that fair?
Yes. I mean, that kind of comes through in terms of the approach to issues as well. The approach to multilateral negotiations, to working with different types of perspectives, because you're not stuck in those things at the level of the mind or your conditioning. You don't see others as others. You see that as a side of you, in a sense. So you tend to work more, let's say, sincerely to build consensus. You tend to kind of hold off judgment on issues for a little longer, to look at different perspectives before you come to some kind of a decision. So those are kind of things that become part of you. I mean, and I would say anyone who's interested in art or poetry or loves nature would come to similar conclusions. So it's not just philosophy or yoga or meditation that gets you to that. Could happen in many ways.
Oh, that was well put. I think the reason Anja and I both wanted to bring that out in this podcast, and perhaps we're going to try and find ways of bringing that out more as in the future of the AI Inequality Initiative, is that many of the people who we see as taking leadership roles in these AI ethical issues, it's not just about their concepts and their principles, but it's very much how they perceive who they are, how they find a grounding in this world, and how they navigate the uncertainties in a future that we can perceive that doesn't have easy answers in terms of which policies you may or may not champion, which kind of governance you may or may not champion.
Yes.
So I'm hopeful that we can find a way of bringing that out more as we develop this project, as we develop what we consider to be this community of practice.
Yes, I really enjoyed a conversation, a seminar some time back. It was a webinar with Peter Hershock, the East-West Center in Hawaii, who's trained in the Buddhist tradition. Then we had, people coming at it, the AI question from different ethical and religious or spiritual perspectives. So that was quite enlightening. And I think there is a role, when we say civil society, multi-stakeholders, there's a role for, in the UN, we use this term called faith-based organizations. You have this kind of tradition now in the Vatican of a deep discussion on AI ethics. There's the Rome Declaration, there's other work. I think there is a role for these perspectives to come into the policy discussions, not in the sense of ethics or the kind of like another stakeholder to bring into the, but in a kind of a more paradigm shifting way, because there is more powerful technologies on the way, whether it's metaverse, and when quantum computing gets going, then there'll be such powerful shifts that, what we've seen in terms of Moore's law and other aspects of these fantastic, powerful changes over the last 60, 70 years, that'll pale in comparison with what's coming. And if we are not stronger as humans, if we're not anchored in our humanness, in a different kind of, we are not wiser as beings, then it'll be very, very difficult for us. So it's not a question of let's be smart about regulation, about policy making, about multilateralism, multi-stakeholderism, but it's also about how are we as humans, how are we as, as our children grow up. And it's at the end of the day, Summit of the Future, it's about the future. So youth voices, children voice. So how are they being trained, or how are they building themselves up as wiser human beings so that they can handle all that complexity.
Amandeep, before we conclude, I would like to raise a few issues that I know that you are particularly passionate about. One of the issues that you've really been pushing hard for is a new type of discussion around data commons. Can you elaborate on that?
Right. Yeah. So this is something that is about the misuse or the good use side of digital technologies. I think if we just focus on the misuse, then we are missing out something. We need to also bend the arc of investments, the arc of research in the direction of good use. And what's the best way to shift the thinking? My view is that we need to collaborate internationally, globally, in a few critical areas such as health, education, the green transition, agriculture and food security, to build data commons where you bring together human capacity, trained human resource, you pool infrastructure or you build up collaborative infrastructure, and you pool data sets, you build gold standard flagship data sets that catalyze research and innovation in these specific areas. For instance, building climate change resilient crop varieties. Just as in the 1950s, 60s, the world got together and built science together in that was critical for the Green Revolution. I think today we need to use the power of data and AI to accelerate research, accelerate science in those kind of ways. And call it CERN for AI, as Gary Marcus puts it, or call it whatever. I think it's important that we also focus in these areas where data can be leveraged to accelerate development. And it's not just about data, it's also about the human capacity around data. Because you have today, by certain estimates, 3.5 million missing data scientists in the SDGs space. So we need to create, just as we have several million missing on the cybersecurity side. So this human element, how do we train public officials, others, to not only be able to deal with data, but also use data to measure where we are on different SDGs, so the metrics of progress, and also the data for innovation, data for accelerating progress. So how do we train people to do this? And how do we empower them with infrastructure that's distributed, that's low cost, so then they are not uploading their data to some centers in certain geographies and not being fully participative in the Sustainable Development Goals agenda. So if I say commons, it means not just data, but also infrastructure, also human capacity, and the global purpose that's provided by the SDGs. So that's really one of the areas where I think we are missing some action, and it's an opportunity again with the Summit of the Future next year to launch some practical initiatives.
And if I may just push you on that, Amandeep, you mentioned human capacity and education and the need to invest in both fields. Are we, in your view, investing sufficiently in humans to interact with this data and also machine-based systems?
Definitely not. So no. I think schools everywhere, not just in the global South, where primary education is important. Schools everywhere need to bring in digital and data, not in the sense of ICT education, not in the sense of putting laptops and tablets in the hands of children, but also what is it to be datafied? When you reduce something to data points, what kind of nuance are you losing? So the thinking that's required around digital and data not just in terms of learning coding or learning to use certain devices. That capacity building is missing today and needs to be upscaled. And as I said, we need more trained data scientists, AI specialists in the development space.
I know you have some creative thoughts on education, so perhaps you can say a bit about that.
Right. So education in the sense of capacity expansion. I mean, in the kind of Amartya Sen, Kentaro Toyama type of understanding of human capacity, where you are able to do more with what you have. I think that in the digital age, so again, leaving aside ICTs and education, it requires a new way of approaching education. It requires adjustments to our curriculum. It also requires schools to be collaborative more across borders and regions, teachers to be collaborating more with case studies, experiences, content, etc. So that can be digitally enabled. We saw during COVID how LXPs, learning experience platforms, were helpful in bringing teachers together in ensuring continuity of education. So what happens after COVID now? Can we, as we look at the SDGs agenda, as we look at engaging the youth, can we go beyond youth participation in meetings to kind of aligning the international agenda with education systems? Education at the end of the day is also very political. It's very touchy. It goes to the heart of national sovereignty issues. But I think there is also an international dimension today with these global challenges around climate change or digital technologies. So can we kind of think about education as also an instrument of better policy making on digital? Let me explain. So if we can prepare our citizens to be more mindful of the challenges, then instead of recruiting 1 million content moderators or spending billions on AI that looks at content moderation, we have lesser of a challenge to handle in terms of self-harm or misuse of data in some ways, because we have citizens who are kind of fit for purpose in a sense for the digital age. They are less likely to be deluded. So we need to see shifts in the education system. And this will involve parents, school administrators, teachers, government regulators, all of us. And you saw a little bit of that discussion during the Transforming Education Summit last September here in New York. So this is the beginning of a story, but this has not got enough attention, but it's very, very important.
And are we doing enough to protect children? Because you said how to educate, how to bring the educators, the regulators on board to make sure that we educate people to be able to engage with digital goods, with common goods, with data, with machine interfaces. But are we doing enough to protect those that may not be at an age where they have the same protections in place? I'm talking now specifically of children. I know UNICEF's been working hard on this. There are organizations you alluded to, IEEE earlier, that have come up with age-appropriate design standards, many other organizations working on this. Are we doing enough?
The blunt answer is no. There are huge gaps, and this is not only about, online sexual abuse, online exploitation of children, but it's also about all kinds of harms. So there's illegal content, there is illegal stuff, but there's also harmful content, harmful stuff. What happens to sleep? What happens to thinking, deeper thinking around issues, self-image, the mental health issues that we've seen with, posts on social media in the UK, and those are considerations that are behind the legislative effort that's underway. So we are certainly not doing enough. There is greater awareness. The social media platforms are under pressure to respond, but what we see now, the surge in terms of content that's there, the the live video streaming, among other things. So our existing investments are not good enough. So you need to devote more resources. There's not only need for clarity in policy, legislative frameworks, the work that IEEE and others have done around age-appropriate design, but there's also need for more resources. Those who are benefiting from greater users on the platform, and often these are users who are below the age of 13. And although the platforms claim that we have ways to check that it's the right age, but it's not working. We know it. So they need to put more resources into child protection online, and they need to kind of work more closely with civil society groups, academics, and others, so that you can also do research. So in a live sense, you can feed back into how you are running the platforms, and they need to work more closely with governments to ensure that the law is being followed, not just in letter, but also in spirit.
And if I may, you spoke earlier about the importance of spirituality, the importance of being grounded in who you are, which is obviously something we're saying that with the digital age, maybe something that we're actually taking away from our kids to be able to form that sense of self. And as the United Nations Technology Envoy, but also a father, for those listeners who are parents and who are grappling with, how do I do this? It's very overwhelming. How do I even start engaging with my kids in such a way that I can give them tools to ground themselves and at the same time navigate digital goods for the positive benefits that it also provides? What will be your recommendations or your insight that you can share with them?
In a very humble way, I think as parents, we need to spend more time with children, be more present in their lives, not in a kind of obsessive, heavy way, but, just to know, first girlfriend, first boyfriend, what happened at school. It's just being more present in their lives. So that's a good insurance against some of these online harms, making sure that, your child is not, feeling lonely, left out at school. So just by being present, having those regular conversations, and then working on the literacy side, the digital literacy side, how they are using apps, how they are registering things, so making sure that, again, as you are present in their lives, you have some kind of a presence in their digital life, and that, you can step them up in terms of responsibility for what they do online with themselves and with others, because, often, victims can be perpetrators. So in terms of cyberbullying and so, and other things. And then, being, I think, more engaged with teachers and other parents. It's also often what you might have the right atmosphere at home, but you have no control over, how others are behaving and what that impact has on your own children. So by being more engaged with the community around schools, I think we are losing a little bit of that. There's too much outsourcing of education and raising of children to these professional institutions, which do a great job. But I think at the end of the day, you can't outsource it as a parent. And digital parenting is different from parenting. So, we have to kind of step up to that. I think the last thing I'd say is that at the end of the day, this is not only about the head, because tech is often seen as this is a mind product. If you're smart, you're writing good code, and it's all coming from the head, and from the head you can change the world. No, you need to bring the heart into the equation. You need to bring the hands into the equation. So with children, if the interplay of head, hand, and heart is fine, then we don't have to worry about the human future in the digital age. They'll take care of it well enough. But if we are kind of going like lemmings into this deluded thing, everything is coming from the mind, code is law and code will solve everything, And I think this is a challenge for all of us as parents, as spouses, siblings, friends, to kind of, be more in the analog world, more with, what's around us, what's with us. It's just very attractive, spending time on screen. There's so much there. You can learn, you can be entertained, etc. But balance. There, something maybe sometimes you're better off cooking something in the kitchen, or calling up a friend and or going for a walk. And
thank you ever so much, Amandeep, for sharing your time, your insights, and your expertise with us. This has truly been a rich and thought-provoking discussion. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in, and a special thanks to the team at the Carnegie Council for hosting and producing this podcast. For the latest content on ethics and international affairs, be sure to follow us on social media at Carnegie Council. My name is Wendell Wallach, and I hope we earn the privilege of your time. Thank you.